Okay. Professor Werner Friedman will talk in English. So, actually, no, Werner Friedman is a wonderful professor at Harvard University. He's the professor for architecture theory and philosophy techniques. Philosophy techniques. He leads the department. Intellectuals are always super interesting and complex, sometimes a bit challenging, or I would say always challenging, which makes them special. So we're looking forward to discussing with you afterwards.
Yeah.
Today, we've talked about space also today in the corrections, but Professor Werner will talk about space from a totally different perspective. So let's start. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me again. I really enjoy having these lectures in the context of your module. I think it's fantastic that you get such a broad kind of scenery or spectrum of different entry points to your topic, which is now space architecture. It's, one could say, about everything. It's not just architecture, which also already is about everything, but space architecture in a way is the self-reflection, no, of the architecture as everything. And I want to start a little bit into a dialogue with respect to that, with a picture of a Versorgungssystem. So it's a cabinet for collection of things, but there is a lot of formality in this cabinet. And the kind of association I would like to open with this is, that's also my approach to the topic. So to relate to this, I call it the Outwith, no, or the outer space, so das All oder der Weltraum. In a proportion or in a relation to the space that we have in our heads for thinking, no? So abstraction, so space, both as something abstract, which we don't naturally have, so we develop our capacities to think space. This is the case, obviously, for architects who actually learn how to build buildings, but it's also the case for everybody who thinks in a structural, in a constructive, in einer architektonischen Denkweise. This used to be the term for it, architectonic. So thought and architectonics relate a lot to this. I chose this one picture as a motif because it shows an amphora, and an amphora is in classical philosophy, in classical metaphysics, specifically with Aristotle, the metaphor or the image he found in order to speak about this notion that will be at the foreground, namely place or topos. No, wie kann man einen Ort denken? How can we think of a place if we do not always already have a notion of space that would contain the location of a place? So this is a bit the ambition. So it's an amphora, but then the amphora is also lying, no? And this is because if we refer to an outer space, the question is what is, or how to think about this boundary between in and out. No, outer space or within. This is how I came up with this notion of the outwith, which I like a lot. In German, we have the beautiful term das All, which is untoppable, I think. But in English, it doesn't exist. No, in English, it is space. And that is a bit complicated. But then Weltraum is also a bit complicated because it kind of says the space where the world is accommodated in. And as you will see, where I try to bring this discussion is basically to say we need, or it would be nice if we learned to think about the space of den Weltraum through a kind of a geography. So, and the geography, so geo comes from the world, but it's a graphics, it's a graphism, so it's an abstract notational system of indexing it. And it maintains, or its idea is that we need to attend to this domain in the cosmos, zum Ort, den Weltraum als Ort, in a speculative and projective way, which says it doesn't properly exist. No? It doesn't properly exist. This is the relation to the philosophical point of view. And for this, there is this notion of, instead of an edge or a boundary, there is this notion of the brink. And the brink, I wouldn't even know. So in German, we would probably call it eine Schwelle, but it also doesn't really capture it, because eine Schwelle would be a threshold. We usually think of a Schwelle in space, but if this space is at once physics, so there is, as we will see, of course, well, there is gravitation, but gravitation neutralized, no? So if there is a physics to this place which is not really existing, then there is also a kind of a cyclical flow of materials, which characterizes this place. And that's why I like this picture of the swelling, because the brink, it means on the one hand an edge or a border of a steep place. So there is a kind of a depth to the threshold. So it's not a superficial, so it's not an immaterial a spatial context. It's also an edge. And it's also a shore. No? It's a shore. And there is a particular activity related to the edge in this sense, which is called a swelling, no? A swelling. So this is like the sea swells, no, before the tides. So there is a movement of a lowering and of a receding of, let's say, waters, or of some kind of contained liquidity. And I would like to invite you to keep this as a kind of a metaphor in your heads. When, for example, architects who engaged early, this is a citation from Fritz Haller, who did a project called Space Colony in, I think, 86. And he characterized, I guess, what is the fascinating aspect for everybody who wants to work with space architecture, that it serves as a kind of a mirror to think very earthly things. No? So he wrote here, das Planen mit neuen, grundsätzlich verschiedenen und deshalb ungewohnten Randbedingungen glich oft einem Leben ohne Boden unter den Füßen. So here's the swelling that I'm talking about. Elementares Wissen fehlte in mancher Hinsicht und könnte nur über noch nicht durchgeführte Experimente erworben werden. Die Ergebnisse der Studie sind deshalb eher Fragelisten und nicht Lösungskonzepte. Now this is I find this very remarkable from an architect who works in such an explicit and such a crystalline way, like Fritz Haller. And then the thing that, probably fascinates us all, es tauchten viele Fragen auf, die auch für unser Erdendasein aktuell sind. Fragen, die wir aus Nachlässigkeit mit der nötigen Konsequenz jetzt noch nicht stellen. So this was 86. No? Today they are, we could say, at the focus point of almost all academic research. Nämlich die Probleme der geschlossenen Kreisläufe beim Stoffwechsel, das Recycling bei den Ver- und Entsorgungssystemen, das Gleichgewicht der Ein- und Abstrahlung der Energie und nicht zuletzt Fragen der Gemeinschaft, des Zusammenlebens, der Rechte und Pflichten des Einzelnen, Fragen über Besitz, Freiheit und so fort. Beim Analysieren der Probleme der Space Colony schien es oft, wie wenn man die Probleme der Bewohner auf der Erde mit der Lupe betrachten würde. And I'm kind of suggesting a very abstract constellation of ideas that are not immediately evident in how they relate, no? This kind of swelling, then a kind of a physicality of which we cannot really say that it exists. So existence is a particular notion I will elaborate on. Then the notion of a place. So what would it mean if we think of eine Raumkapsel, no? As a place, as a topos, more than as a an isolated capsule, no? As an isolated subsystem that kind of duplicates immediately what we think of. So it's precisely because I think that in order to think about these things, so especially the circular and the cyclical topics that are predominant, related to recycling, related to sustainability, and so on, needs to have actually competency in space architecture. And this is because all these notions that go circular, they meet the problem of self-reference at its logical core. So how can a self-reference be treated in a way that doesn't pose a tautology, so a stopping point, and yet still is useful in a formalist, in a practical manner? No? So how can we, so if we want to explain something and we say, well, I am me, okay, it's the starting point. But in a way from this, so what I'm suggesting is that in this kind of self-reference, there is this amphora, this place, which is a boundary place, and which provides containment in a kind of a swelling that is always larger than what it maintains itself in. So, what I promised in my abstract, and I don't remember if eine Haltung im Weltraum is actually whether I put it to German or not. So what I would like to focus on is a stance in the outwith of the world. And in order to think this, there is a connection between place, topos, as a kind of a container, no? a mobile vessel, and a notion of essence, of essentiality, and of fulfilling. So a thing, that was the old idea. A thing can only grow up to its full potential if it is in the right place. No? We often still have this in our sayings colloquially. When we are not easy with something, we say, wow, but you are not really in your right place now, no? Or these kind of wordings. This is a moral and an ethical connotation that relates to the notion of place, which has a lot to do with the fact that place and space are not coextensive, no? So when we think about, for example, today through digital media, this location, what do they call it? Geopositioning systems and these location-specific trackings that they do. Then what they do is they locate a place in a global grid of reference, no? of a spatially indexed mapping of the world. And what I am interested in is to free the notion of place out of this lock situation. And in order to free it, something like space colonies in our heads, in our thinking, are a beautiful way to proceed. No? They're probably not more and not less. So if you want to solve problems, you can do that quite well within the scope of established ways of addressing problems. But if you want to do an Entwurf, no? If you have an ambition to be an architect, not primarily an engineer with this, then I guess such a kind of projectivity is important. Danke vielmals. So, but how could we possibly relate to that? No, because if we stay within a logical way of thinking, where the self-reference produces de facto a tautology, which is a deadlock, we can't really get there. And what I want to suggest is that the domain which for centuries, for 2000 years de facto, people have started to call intellect or intelligence, is quite similar in this non-existential physicality, a cognitive kind of physicality, like der Ort im Weltraum. No? So that this Weltraum it's not properly the space of the universe at large. We will see in a moment how concretely I mean this. But it's a physical space. No, there are forces. There is matter. There is light. There is energy. There's a physicality to it. Even so, as a place, we can't really capture it through space. But when we build such a capsule, this we will see with Fritz Haller in a moment, then building this capsule would be in a proportion like logics to intellectuality, like the capsule to the Weltraum. No? So this is the proportion I want to suggest. So to think of the logical space it's not quite coextensive with the space of intellection, just like the space that is articulated in a Raum capsule is not quite coextensive to the notion of space as a universal, as an, das All, no, a space as well. So not quite coextensive doesn't mean they have nothing to do with each other. They have everything to do with each other, but it brings us into a proportionate frame set where we have A to B is like C to D. No? So intellect to logics is like space is to A space, A articulated space. So that's the proposal in which I want to hold on to. But I show you here is a very remarkable book that was recently published by Catherine Malabou. She is, I'm not sure really if she is primarily a cognitive scientist or a philosopher. She's kind of both at the same time. And she became very, quite famous in philosophy in the recent years for a notion that she called plasticity. And plasticity tries to answer to this kind of non-existing physicality. Yeah, because it says, so plasticity on the one hand, so things can be a lot of other things at the same time. How can we address things if they are plastic? If it belongs to their essential characteristic that they are plastic. And from this earlier work, she recently started to look at a topic that I think everybody now, since 1 year at least, is very much pre-concerned with. It's this open AI, so it's artificial intelligence in this latest generation, no? I'm sure you have done your experiments with the ChatGPT and with the image engines in parallel. It's quite fascinating how from giving prompts, you hear a kind of a common sense, an anonymous and a generic common sense coming back to what you call out. So I think it's very important that we address and think about this latest generation of AI, no longer through an epistemological space that would try to mimic or to double the true notion of intelligence or the human notion of intelligence or a non-human, a transhuman notion of intelligence as a kind of absolute, but it's really a dialogical relation. It's a dialogical relation which we start to have through the new interfaces with a notion of artificial intelligence that is kind of it's a common sense intelligence. So it sources, it gathers its info from everything that people have thought and that is documented, about things. And it learns self-referentially. But it learns from how we send prompts. No? So it's no longer a kind of a Versorgungssystem like this one, where things would be put in place, where you have drawers, where you have a classification system that would characterize, here is the place for this kind of thing, and here is the place for this kind of thing. It's no longer like that. But an ongoing kind of mapping happens, which does not foresee static places for knowledge or for the things that we make reference to, or that this kind of intelligence makes reference to. And that kind of mapping, which goes on always live, always self-referentially, no? Self-referentially, but on many scales. So this large self-referentiality grows from millions of people sending prompts and not being orchestrated in how they do so. No? And this, so you see this sending prompts, this comes to, in this analogy between logics and the domain of the intellect, and space capsule and space in the sense of das All. Now I lost the connection. So it's always a kind of a crossing of a border where there is a swelling, no? So when you've done experiments, the most fantastic thing with the OpenAI is starting after maybe 15 iterations, no? So you have something you want to get insights, to get inspiration for. In the beginning, we cannot but ask rather awkwardly and directly, as if we ask a dictionary, please tell me this word, what did it used to mean, or something like that. When we stay on that level, it is quite insulting, actually, what comes back, because when we ask a question, usually we kind of know what the common sense is, no? So, but we have an interest that is not captured by this common sense. So how do we get to a level where we can ask questions, where we can speak about our quests, we could say, unsere Suche, in a way that this crowd, this gathered artificial collective intelligence is not just always putting us back in a place where we want to live, no? So when we have a question, we feel there's something to be won if we go beyond it. So we want to leave the place where we are. But these AI systems, they send us back to where we are located on the first level when we ask. But if you start to indulge in a dialogical exchange, if you start to, like you do with people, no? When you try to figure out something with somebody, one cannot just always go straight forward. No? So the classical example is this thing, no? When a love relation is no longer working well and people start to ask each other, do you still love me? Well, it's the capitulation, usually, So the thing that you would like to have confirmed gets more and more vulnerable the more and more you try to get this almost obscene immediacy. So if you start to think about this kind of collective artificial intelligence in a similar way, so of course you have interests, but you cannot just go logically, straightforwardly to it. It needs tact, ein Taktgefühl. It needs a kind of a melodiousness. It matters how you ask, not just whether you find the right words which are unbiased and obvious. No, you need to kind of become poetic. You need to figure out how to talk to this thing in a way that you actually learn and that it helps you to travel, no? Like a bit of a spaceship, to travel on your quest a little bit further. And if you start to do this, we're doing a studio in Zurich who extensively explores this kind of figuring out a theme, an articulation and an approach. Then it's fantastic because you can start to speak. So this dialogical is not just you and the standardized or the mean value of all these voices which are collected, but you need to start to talk in many voices as well. So it starts to get interesting when you have a quest and you, for example, say, what would Alberti, with his interest in fables, have asked ChatGPT what space architecture is? No? And then you feed in the PDF, Alberti's fables, and then first you get silly questions. But you know Alberti's fables and you know what you want to learn, so you reformulate. No? Or you can do the same with another. You can take a movie, you can feed in the dialogues of the movie script and say, that particular characteristic, this Stimmung, which is in that episode where they have this and this and this exchange. How could I picture this to explain it to somebody who hasn't seen the film? And then you get into a kind of a poetic, an analytical, a formalistic, but a poetic way of engaging with this huge artificial intelligence, which is kind of out there, but you are in it at the same time. And again, this out there and yet in it, this is this place that I mean now is the amphora. This is this place of a kind of a swelling where there is a containment, but this containment is at the same time something like a spaceship, or even also a time ship, actually. No? So through this notion of the space. So what Catherine Malabou did in this remarkable book is she asked the question that is not often attended to with regard to AI. It's a question, no, usually they argue with, well, how can IQ even be measured? What is a quotient, no? The EQ quotient. What should that even be, the philosophers? And they say, no, they will insist it's not quantitative, it's qualitative, and so on. So they will refuse that. And there are a lot of logical disputes around this. No? So it has become very sophistic. So sophistic in the sense of the sophistry. No? So positions which fight each other, and all of them are kind of on weak grounds. So, but they try to take territory because they believe it's right what they think spiritually. No, it's not rational. It gets very religious. If you follow these discourses, you will see it's not just ideological, it's very religious how people relate to this question of the AI. So what she did instead is she started to look, well, how on earth did they actually start to think about the intellect as something that can be measured? So what were these first people who introduced these formulas? What did they hope to do? Why were they embarking on that quest? What was at stake? And what she found is very interesting in a kind of a proportionate or in an analogous way, reasoning to our time today, because she found that, so this happened in the Enlightenment, the 18th century, the first attempts to actually measure this. And it came from an interesting constellation about the status of knowledge, which you probably know in Renaissance. No, there started to be what I don't remember where the term modern actually. The term model has become a label in so many different master narratives. It's confusing to anchor it. But in Renaissance, there were all these new measurement devices. No, there were new telescopes. There were there were all sorts of new measurement devices, which gave an enormous push to a kind of an empirical, experimental way of doing science according to the mathematical way of thinking. So no longer the trivium, but the quadrivium became predominant in the Renaissance. The trivium is the language-related arts, and the quadrivium is the mathematics-related arts. So the trivium is rhetorics, grammar, and dialectics, and they used to be foundational. No? For every education, the first thing everybody needs to learn is the trivium arts. They are the foundations, and then based on that, there can be the quadrivium arts, which are music, which are arithmetics, geometry, and astronomy. These four, usually. No, there is an interesting story where and whether architecture fits in one of these two, but that would be a digression now, so I leave it out. So what happened in the Renaissance is the quadrivium became a liberating factor. Suddenly, with all these devices, you don't need to logically have disputes about a true interpretation or not. And the true interpretation, it got so sophistic. You can see this from the example of Pico della Mirandola, who was a Renaissance mind, one of the key figures of the Italian Renaissance. And he was really a polymath. So he was learned in all the different fields where one could be learned. And there is a story of his graduation when he wrote the PhD, or it was not comparable to what we today call a PhD, but it was his doctor, when he acquired his doctor of philosophy, which also made at that time science, because it was natural. So philosophy was natural philosophy. So science and philosophy were not separated. So he delivered a treaty, not just on one thesis. No? So usually at that time, you would speak about one thesis for which there are 25 experts And if you want to get your title, you need to top all of these 25, so they will acknowledge, wow, you point to something we have not considered. And you can imagine how unlikely this is on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can imagine how drastic and how spitzfindig you have to become when you want to do that. So Pico della Mirandola was a Renaissance man with the technical devices. He inverted the setup. He came and said, I will defend a thesis on 947 theses. Yeah. So he addresses the frame, yeah, of how the disputes were there. And then rather than saying this frame now becomes a logical object, which I want to convince you of, this would always be hopeless. No, you cannot change the mindsets of the people that have already made their lives in comfortable positions in that mindset. But instead, he gave a disputation where he basically took as many of the specialized theses showing how they can be accommodated. Yeah. So it's space architecture. So this is Renaissance. But the way how he came to do so is because he gave predominance not to what is rightly called the dogmatic stance with regard to the trivium, so to logical positions and theories. But he wanted to challenge them with the new natural technology means which are available. So this kind of taking away the authority of knowledge, no? Who says when something is valid or worthwhile? So this was always with the church in Europe at that time. But in Renaissance, universities started to be founded in the cities. So they would have to be okay with the bankers, with the politicians, and with the church people. And they would welcome anybody, even if you don't want to become a priest or a theology person. So universities were founded, and it produced an immense confusion, no, about authority. Whom can we believe? And then what if they fight? And you know the cliché story, which were hard enough, of course, but still. So people who really then try to address the change of the reference system in cosmology, they had actually been sentenced to death by the church in order not be, well, it's an interesting question to understand. I think ethically, it's an interesting question to understand why this happened. No, I think one can give a lot of much too easy answers to these questions. So then by the time of the Baroque, this was the culmination, no? Baroque is the culmination of this abstraction, where you have encoded systems everywhere, no? So there are everything is super dressed up in the sense of symbolically coded. So there are protocols of behavior for 1,000 different situations, for 1,000 different roles, and so on. You know, the masks and the theatricality of the court life and so on, that Baroque stories are talking about. And then the Enlightenment kind of tried to bring this to a ground, not to put it on feet, by saying there is a notion of the absolute intellect, or the faculties of understanding, which are exactly the same for everybody who is human, who can think. And these faculties of understanding, they started to be at odds with advances that the sciences would bring. So statistics, for example, was very annoying, no, for Enlightenment, as something that is not just a strategy and an instrument, but that actually counts as knowledge. How can something statistical count as knowledge? So there were many disputes like that, where the sciences could not grow, they could not unfold. And this is what she describes as the context where then people started to say, okay, let's say the faculties of reason, they might be absolute, and in this way that Enlightenment philosophy says, but there is a notion of the intellect, which is not personal. No? So then the reason became very personal. So basically, if somebody is educated, it means the person develops into the full potential in society through learning to see things in a way that is contracted in society. So this is very much the Enlightenment stance. So they started to say, no, but there is to thinking and to science a domain which is, they used to call it the intellect, and it's not the same like reason. The intellect, and this intellect is impersonal, so it doesn't matter in this intellect whether we are we or whether it is, I don't know, an automatism or something like that. And the iconic reference is, of course, techniques for this. So a mechanism, if you figure out how a mechanism works, it will always work, regardless of who you are, regardless where you live or where you do an experiment, it always works, no? But explaining why it always works, that's a bit of another story. And this is what they what they wanted to win a space for, with measuring the intellect, no? With the IQ protocol. So they figured out ways how, if somebody has a proposal, no, that was offending to the common sense, the established one, how can he find the grounds to make a case? Even so, it might be a bit threatening, but people need to domesticate this new thing from abstraction. No? It's like, so when in mathematics, it's always like some meteors are falling to Earth and change everything. So when you have new numbers, when you go from the natural numbers to the real numbers, or when you go from the real numbers to the imaginary, to the complex numbers, nothing is the same after these numbers are acknowledged. So they are these abstractions that come from mathematics, they're always like exploring new galaxies. It feeds back on the place where you are. So what you felt is very secure and very evident and cannot be otherwise, suddenly appears as one possible way, which could very well be otherwise. This is tremendously unsettling. But it's also the most normal thing, no? We all know that knowledge is power. And it's through such unsettling that this happens. So they started to say, well, we need to say, then it's not personal, but these people who learn how to do, so it was also the time, of course, where the shift from thermodynamics to quantum dynamics happened. And it was enormous when you start to say matter is not fire, earth, and air, and it's not some kind of chemical affinity tables of substances that kind of are affiliated to each other in a certain way. But when you have the particle, this abstraction, the particle, so it changes everything. So there is a relation between physics, between the space of abstraction, between the domain of science and the responsibility of the scientist, which must be an ethical one, with the measurement of the intellect. And then, so this was let's say, the covered up start of this kind of study, which lasted not very long, because very quickly in the 19th century, when you can classify something objectively, people get fantasies of how you can make it into a social tool immediately. And what came out of it were, of course, very brutal and very literally eugenic instruments, to classify smart people from not smart people and so on. So she goes through this history and shows where the change has happened. And interestingly, what she shows very often is that those scientists who came up with a formula that proved useful in this application were themselves really, really not wanting to do this. So, but that's the thing with the intellectual space. If you put it there, it's available. And your intentions, when you put it there, don't matter for what other people will do with it. So for better or worse. So she goes through this history, and then, and that's where it becomes really interesting for the creative disciplines, for the design disciplines, or I would say specifically Entwurf, is when she starts to say, well, then how were the nuances? So what, for example, is the distinction then between approaches of intuition, the intuition as something that can be schooled. So for you, it's all quite evident. I think you train your intuition. You have collections of things. You try to compare projects that you find interesting, and to kind of tune your thinking and your sensitivity and your receptivity to get sensitive towards certain things, which in the beginning are not that evidently there. So there is a bodily dimension suddenly to this abstract domain. And what I now found very nice in relation to our topic here, with this proportion between intellect, how did I say? Intellect is to logics, like Weltall space is to the logical space, is to a particular articulated space, and capsule, or so a building. Is this this characterization here. So what the different stances kind of try to say is that the intelligence is like life looking outward, putting itself outside itself, adopting the ways of unorganized nature in principle in order to direct them in fact. Yeah. So intelligence is a kind of a stepping next to yourself. And one can go to, of course, spiritual and mystical practices where many would say it's exactly the same thing which happens, but we don't need to, because we all know it from quite bodily practices. So when we try to learn how to ride a bike, I don't remember, but I observe children who do it, no? Or swim, or learn to play an instrument. In the beginning, we all feel quite stupid. No, we really don't know how. There are some say, look, just move like this or do like that or do it. And you don't feel it. You don't feel that it works. You don't understand why you should even train it like that. And suddenly your body learns, you get it, no? And then you can start to grow with it. So this is a kind of, so wherever there is exercise and discipline in that sense, it's not a kind of an authority, no, that we surrender to. It's not somebody who tells us, now move your hand, and then we get resistance towards this authority. No, it's a kind of it's an outer space, it's an intellectual domain, which is totally improper in the sense of uneigentlich. It doesn't belong to anybody. Nobody has special privileges in that. Not really. Huh? So, and this I think is very, very interesting, no? To reanimate a little bit this wider scope where these contemporary questions are coming from. Okay, this was much longer than I had actually planned, but I guess I can be shorter now. This here is an extraordinary scholar. I just found her yesterday. I understand very little because it's Russian, but she kind of, she has like 20 different texts on academia on precisely that relation. So the existence, existentialism, space and place. And in this article here, she brings this manner of relating the domains together in a very poignant way. She says, so this article will present an existential projection. So this is interesting. Huh? What is an existential projection? And if anything, what is a space capsule if not an existential projection? Of the correlation of concepts of space and place, it is shown that exactly the boundary of the human place reveals the dialectic relationship between man and space, separating him from the totality of the whole, and at the same time including him into the order of the whole. Yeah, this is a metaphysical sentence. Huh? So when you start to, I have a slide from Aristotle where he introduces this notion of place. Maybe it's a good time to look at it. It's this one here. No, it's from physics. He also spoke of it in other books, in the heavens and in the categories. But this one is, I think, helpful for us because you see the question it asks. It says, so let us consider in how many ways one thing is in another. In one way, as a finger is in the hand, and as a part is in the whole. In another way, as the whole is in the parts. For the whole is not without parts. In yet another way, a man in an animal, as a species in a genus. And yet another way, a genus is also in a species. And a species, and is part of a species in the definition of the species. Now, so you see, so we could say today easily, this is set theory, nothing is a problem anymore because we have a logical formalism. But it doesn't solve the problem, does it? Because we want to capture a notion of place. We don't need to have the conclusion which is the best accepted one. We need to ponder the Stimmung, the presence of a place which does not, in the logical sense, exist. Yeah. So this I don't remember why I highlighted it, but it must be a kind of a nucleus story. So let's read it. So in short, but this is that for the sake of which a thing subsists. So then it's about the subsistence of a thing. It's not just the existence. It's like there is a subsistence without there being a proper domain where it exists already. And this is something you can think of this like, with this we can understand better why a place would be this relation where a thing can fully develop its potentials. No? Because unless we have also, we are inhabiting this intellectual space, no? Where we can do things that we haven't been able to before. So before we had learned to play an instrument, or before we have learned to draw, or before we have learned anything. So we can realize ourselves through processes that demand that we surrender first, no? To something where we don't matter that much. But it will put us in the right place if we do it. In the end, it's a bit of a question of a faith. No, nobody can guarantee it, but it's literally in your hands and in the faith into a kind of an impersonal domain where knowledge exists beyond how it is being instrumentalized. And that comes, so what is here called a subsistence. No? So it's like there is a pre-specificity. No? Because, so it's again with this notion of the plasticity. So when we come to the world, it's not decided. No? But we are organized in a certain way, which is not exactly the same like for others. So a domain of the subsistence. So existence means Dasein. So X is going out, and then sistere means sein or bleiben. No? So to have a duration. And subsistence is like diving deep. No? And this diving deep, we don't necessarily need to say, we go into our unconscious and into our kind of archetypical depth, no? that romanticism was so fond of. We can think of this in many ways. We can think of this, for example, subsistence in order to inhabit a domain of abstraction of the complex numbers, of which almost nobody has an idea how to even picture them. Well, we can dive into how it means to inhabit the real if it is not the evident thing. No? So if the real is kind of continuity, it's not put in question, but its self-evidence is put in question. You see? And this is a bit the kind of twist that I think we need to learn to take with this artificial intelligence. So we need to, how could it be possible? No? So the things that we trust because they're evident, they're the most likely thing. Nobody would ever question. No, I don't question that that my body knows better how to breathe than I do. If I would have to control and decide to take a breath in the right moment, I don't trust I would remain healthy very long. My body does it, no? So this is the kind of things where it's our habits. We trust it, we live it, we build on it. And we have these kinds of things, not just with regard to our bodies, we have it also with regard to ideas, worldviews. We don't put it in question. It's just evident. Everybody else will say so too. No? But it's with regard to things like that we need to, when we go to this subsistence, when we try to get in touch with that, we need to start to find ways of interrogating it or of being dialogical with it. Well, is it really so self-evident? But then how else could it be? No? And to get into a kind of an interrogating, a projective, an existentially projective stance of going about the quest. And this existentially projective stance would be to ask for something, not like we say, okay, here is the problem, please give me your solution, no? Or please figure out a spectrum of 20 different solutions to the problem, which is exactly that. It means to say, no, actually, how the problem is put as a problem, that's where the self-evidence needs to be refused. Perhaps what forms as a problem here actually wants to express something that it doesn't yet take into account. No? So we need complexity thinking. All the things that chaos theory, system theory, and so on were always kind of trying to tell us. But here, we don't need it in an argumentative way. We need it in a sensed, in a felt way. So we need to risk our stability by allowing that kind of interrogation. And then suddenly this kind of artificial intellect, which is so, a bit offensive, no? Because it always puts you back in place. You ask something because you think you want to explore, and then it says, well, here you are. No? And the extraordinary things are hard to get out, hard to tickle out from it. But then it becomes actually your conspirator. So then with that, you can navigate in a way that doesn't need to cut with the social consensus of such an evidence, but it can learn to tactfully challenge it a little, no? So to tactfully see how to place things that don't need to make a counterposition or open up a debate and force people to decisions, but to kind of change the tonality, to change the mood in talking about it. And for all of this notion of place is crucial. And place is not the position in a location system like the GPS. A place really has something to do with a realization of a potential that is ideally realized to the full. But what does that mean? No? That's again the question with the intellect. So how can we measure the intellect? What would be the realization to the full? Because the full means if one could say here it is reached, then it would, it would just become a property. It would not be perfection. No? It would not have a relation to growing indefinitely. No, and this is so we should, in a short nutshell, perhaps we should think of these cognitive tools, of these logical instruments, really as instruments, not as tools. No, because tools, they are established in contexts where they are handy. With this tool you can treat that kind of problem. With this tool you can treat that kind of problem. So this is all in the smallness of the kind of Ordnungssystem of such a setup, no? But when you have an instrument, who has ever exploited the full potential of a violin, for example? I don't think anybody in the world would claim that, no? And it's beautiful because it also means anybody who can play the violin will not be so jealous about somebody else playing it in a totally different way. It will be amazed, no? It will be learning from that. So we have this kind of generosity with regard to artifacts if we place them not as the property of an author, but in this public domain of collection. But in this public domain, and that's why the story that Malabou is telling, I think, is really important. We don't control what it will be used for. Huh? So but that's exactly why it will be a public domain. Because there's no protocol regulation that will safeguard everyone else. So the culture in this public domain of the intellect, of the outer space, will decide whether it will be a livable world or a wishful world or not. So it's a kind of a utopian place that is entirely rational, and yet it is not, in the classical sense, a rationalist idea, because it lives from many rationalities. So the rationality of the natural number is just as much a rationality as the one of the complex numbers, but they're not the same. No? Just like the physics, the forces now in outer space, when we describe these places, gravitation, they are physics just as much as a food engineer does physics when he studies how to synthesize the flavors of a certain chemical compound, for example. It's always physics. But physics is nature, and nature becomes, I would say, wedded with philosophy. Yeah? And wedded, this is, I don't know, it's a bit silly, and it's a thing that is quite fresh for me to think about. I was always thinking there can be nothing more anthropocentric than this, but there is this feminist philosopher. She's also concerned a lot with these topics. She's called Lucy Irigaray, and she wrote a series of late books which she calls the Elemental Passions series. And what she does there is basically say it's like placing the passions to such an intellectual domain. So saying the passions are the most intimate that make us, and that where we feel us as us, and yet there is something impersonal about them. If we try to, because of course we need to relate to the passions of the others, so there needs to be a tertium datur, no? There needs to be a kind of an objectification which will not exhaust and exactly represent my own, but it will be a common sense world. So, and this, she says, we need to elementarize the passions. We need to have an elementary approach to the passions. But the notion of the element, and that is what makes her work, Lucy Irigaray, so beautiful, is not one of logicism and of now recently I always forget what they call it. It's not axiology, it's axionomy. Yeah? So where you have the foundations, where then you get the elements. It's not such a notion of the element. It's one of Aristotle. It's one where the elements, so here, everything can have a place. This is the link of the notion of the amphora, of the place in Aristotle's natural philosophy. Everything has a place because everything is made up of the elements, water, fire, earth, and air. And sometimes, depending on the approach, it would be something like quintessence, no, a fifth element. So that means there is nothing which would be only water or only fire. So we cannot go analytically about elements. No, it's almost the opposite of what people tell us today. They say when you want to learn to think analytically, you need to elementarize things, but you do it according to a grid logics, like when you have a geoposition location. It was not like that. So the elements were always everywhere mixed. And in the cosmological ideas of the old thinkers, of the metaphysicians, these elements would be inherent directions to them. No, so air would rise, for example, and water would fall. I don't know. So there was and they had different views of that, but that was part of what was called meteorology. No, meteora. So the study of the weather, everything is a weather phenomenon because the weather interferes in the circuits which leads to the transformation of things. So we need to eat, but in order for us to eat, the food needs to grow. In order for that, the soil needs to be fertile and the water needs to come down. And if it were salt water, wow, things would not grow, it would be disaster. No? So there is a kind of a sustainability, a huge tradition of metaphysical and cosmological sustainability and recycling thinking related to this coupling of elements to place, that I think is extremely promising for us to reconnect with, because it can truly show us ways to think of self-reference in a formal and also in a logical way, but not as we today think logics. Huh? So just the formality of an argument. Okay, but now let's maybe I try to end rather soon so we can talk as well. So this here is this is Fritz Haller, a Swiss architect, who is a bit surprisingly or a bit disappointingly for him as well, I think, very famous for the USM Haller furniture. No, so this beautiful structure of bureau möbel, which made him very autonomous. So he developed this for an exhibition where he wanted to show his architecture. So it was really a byproduct. It was not his ambition to become a designer, but it gave him so much money and Unabhängigkeit that then he could also, as an architect, be very, very radical. And one of the projects that he did with students in Karlsruhe was this one here, Space Colony. Eine Siedlung für 1000 Bewohner im erdnahen planetarischen Raum. You see also the cautiousness of articulating it. It's 87. And here is some remarkable, no, how he frames this. So 87, imagine, no GPS, no mobile phones, not even personal computers. And he thinks about the problem of space like this. He says, der Traum der Menschheit, in den Kosmos vorzustoßen, ist in diesem Jahrhundert Wirklichkeit geworden und die Nutzung dieses neuen Verfügungsbereiches hat bereits begonnen. Wir telefonieren, wir sehen fern mittels Einrichtungen die Signale über geostationäre Satelliten von jedem Ort zu jedem anderen Ort der Erdoberfläche transportieren können. Nutzungen der physikalischen Besonderheiten des Weltraums sind eingeleitet oder werden vorbereitet. Die durch diese neuen Techniken entstehenden Veränderungen unserer Lebensmöglichkeiten sind noch weitgehend unbekannt und im Dunkeln verborgen. Das hier Dargestellte ist ein Versuch, an einem realen Projekt für eine menschliche Siedlung im erdnahen Raum etwas von diesen Veränderungen zu erfahren. You see the kind of quest, no? He says, I'm doing this experimental project because I want to learn about the questions that it allows me to pose. So maybe this is overdoing it, but one can read the entire study that he does a bit like, how can we learn to work with ChatGPT? No. And then also this, no? he cited this from a NASA report from 1977. And this I make it very large because I really am glad to read about it. So, die physikalischen Eigenschaften des Weltraums sind ziemlich paradox. Er scheint leer zu sein und doch finden sich dort wertvolle Energiequellen, Materie und gefährliche Strahlungen. Er scheint undifferenziert und doch ist er durchzogen von Hügeln und Tälern der Gravitation. Rau und ohne Leben bietet er Lebensmöglichkeiten, die weit über die der Erde hinausgehen. Es ist einfacher, zu entfernten Orten im Weltall zu reisen, als zwischen eng benachbarten zu verkehren. No, and this is, for example, a sentence, this last one, that I find gets a drastic new relevancy with the social media, no? With our realities. It is much easier to go and study something which we feel has very little to do with us. So to go travel, I don't know, to a place where we really feel as a tourist, than to engage with the social bubble in which we don't want to belong today. No? So it's an interesting correlation there. All right. Then here, so this is the concrete design, and what I will propose now is to no, not to study. So I didn't research the physics and all of that, but I want to kind of. So how would I now, if I want to work with ChatGPT, how would I try to figure out what kind of interesting prompts to write? And what is interesting is, of course, that there is a pseudogravitation. No? So this is quite mind-blowing to think about really what that is or why that can be, or so, a pseudogravitation. And do I have it here? The pseudogravitation has even something to do with this, with the place of the capsule. Wait, where is my larger? Yeah, but you probably know, no? So there are some places in space there on the axis of the Earth to the Moon where gravitation neutralizes itself. They're called Gravitationstäler oder Höhen. So it's really a kind of a geography in the space. Even so, it's not, so it is physical, no, but it's not like you don't have hills and so on. So this is a metaphorical description. But there are these places, and the ones which lend themselves for placing long-term space stations are the ones where gravitation neutralizes itself. And if you think about it, this is quite mind-blowing that such places exist, no? So, and it is in such a place that they thought of this structure. So then the gravitation is done with this rotation engine. I don't quite understand how, but it's coming from here. But what you have here is a huge parabolic mirror. And this is very interesting because it does many things. So the parabolic mirror, it catches the the sunlight, no? So here it says Sonnenlicht. So here is the sunlight coming. Then what the parabolic mirror does, so this is from a kind of make it easy for the students, physics classes, basics. So I Googled this. Huh? So, but I think it will probably not be too wrong. And it captures like the main messages about Parabolspiegel. So zu den asphärischen Hohlspiegel, das heißt, seine Oberfläche ist nicht Kugel, sondern verschieden, that's the thing. So, ist nicht kugelförmig, sondern besitzt verschiedene Steigungen. So the art of making a parabolspiegel literally means that everywhere on this whole surface area, this is not smooth. So the Steigungen, they are calculated into a kind of a landscape that will be optimal for exactly this construction. So it's very, very aufwendig to make Parabolspiegel, but they can function as emissions and as antennas. So it collects parallel rays and it focuses them into it's also interesting. You know, these things like their focus, the focus heißt Brennpunkt. For me, at least, Brennpunkt was metaphorical and focus was technically precise. But from a natural philosophy point of view, Brennpunkt is precise, and focus is a kind of a metaphor, no? Because it's literally, it's not just the light that lets us see. It's not about perspective, it's optics, it's a physics. So the light insofar as it is radiation, so it produces energy and it burns things. So we are here with the domain of acoustics, which is kind of an introvert. Yeah, I don't go there. But it's, you see, these are optical engines that kind of play in this intellectual domain, because it's not about our point of view. Yeah, it's literally creating. So the capturing of the sunlight in parallel rays, the focus, it's like a steam engine that is optical, no? The focusing it into a Brennpunkt, which will then feed and sustain the entire artificial living environment. It's kind of cool. It's a super rational setup made entirely out of optics. So perspective is not, no, it's not like it's proved wrong. So the study of making representations of personal points of views and how to put them in relation, and then a notion of the object, which should somehow mediate between different perspectives. So all these things which we are so preoccupied with when we think logically, and not in the outer space of the outwith, they're not, they just become like a very small island of things that are relevant in this, no? So this is optics. Optics creates an environment, a milieu. And it does several things. So it also produces energy, but it also enters light and so on. Und die Anwendungsgebiete sind Scheinwerfer, Teleskope, Sonnenkollektoren und Satellitenschüsseln. So with this we can attend not only to light radiation, but also to antennas, to sound, to everything that can be rendered into sound. So there is basically, it's a kind of a mirror, imagine, no? It gives a duplication of what goes in, but this duplication is a transformed one. No? So we have, so the morph, what did Catherine Malabou say, no? The not morphology, morphisms of the intellect. So it's a changed body of the same thing that is being mirrored. So this is maybe the key point I want to bring to, no? Then what can we do with this kind of proportion that kind of says the logical space and the domain of the intellect is proportionate to what did I say? The space, no, the articulation, the concrete building, and the outer space, no? So the outwith space. So we need a kind of a mirroring or of a reflection, like she said, no, not here. She said here, so it's a dialectical, so Topos, this Russian scholar, how did she put it? Here. The existential projection puts a correlation between space and place, and it says exactly the boundary of the human place reveals the dialectic relationship between man and space. No? So my quest with this idea of how to have a stance, how to maintain a stance in the, so eine Haltung im Weltraum. No? So it's really about ethics in a way, and this ethics is, so we cannot, so man and space, so dimension in Weltraum, we cannot figure out a proportionate way of relation if we either say, well, of course, we need to anthropomorphically colonize it, or we need to think in a way which have nothing to do with the human life form. No? So it's somehow an in-between, no? Where the human life form will morph into something else when actually territories in space become available. But why would one have to say it's something also totally different? So that's the ethics, no? About a proportionateness, finding adequacies, and finding adequacies means having a proportion. No? When I so there things are out of proportion when let's say the Mittel der Abstraktion, the means of abstraction, are totally unnecessary for the thing that one then actually talks about. So, and this with regard to space travel has a little bit of a corrective, because in a way the means of abstraction they're of the highest kind that exist today, no? But the fantasies kind of try to make an existence minimum. So we need more fantasy, no? We need to invent what to do. And this is now, with this I want to close, because I want to suggest quite a literal analogy, one more, between the parabola mirrors, no? So with the parabola mirrors, what is being reflected can be transformed. And this kind of mirroring has an own genre in literature, and it's called parables for the same reason. No? So eine Parabel, it's a story which contains a teaching. It's a bit like eine Fabel. And one of the most surprising Fabeldichter, by the way, was Alberti. He has a whole volume entirely written, where basically all his it's like Pico della Mirandola, no? These Renaissance men, they really had to fight towards the dogmatism, the institutional ones, but they didn't want to fight. They wanted to liberate thought. So Alberti, that's why he wrote so much and so literary. So he has a whole volume of fables, and the fables have usually a very kind of human-centric morale, which they contain, and the parables are like the fables, but they're more in this space of the intellect, in this impersonal space, because they convey a teaching. And there is one book, it's already now, it was published 2002, and I still think it's absolutely the best book if you want to figure out what people mean with this notion of the virtual. As it is ubiquitous. So not the virtual that comes with metaverse and with the engineering discourse, but the virtual which has something to do with claiming a fulfillment, so the possibility to grow to one's greatest possibility or something like that. It's not quite the potential. It's not exactly the same like a possibility, because possibilities, they need to be countable. Possibilities are when you get a menu in a restaurant and then you choose your dish. The potential, this is very material. It brackets out what you can learn to become from inhabiting the space of the intellect, the potential. Or if it includes the space of the intellect, then the potential is precisely no longer a potential in the physical sense, but it becomes a virtuality, and it plays with actuality. No? This book is beautiful, and the title, look at this, Parables for the Virtual. It completely escaped me. I had worked a lot with that book, then I got very fed up with the reception it got. It's like the most cited text, but it's very, they make a war machine out of Masumi's beautiful texts, for fighting for something here and there and there and there, and I totally stopped the reception for it. But it had escaped me that the title is Parables for the Virtual. So the stories he writes about, they're much like the parabolic antennas. No? He doesn't try to represent the virtual and then say how we can relate to it. And that's also why it is such a beautiful text to relate to artistic research and to creativity, because it's really about how can we build out such antennas from our screen that are for the virtual? How can we collect parallel lines of things which give us a kind of a creative energy, if you want, or the energy necessary to put the evident into question without wanting to make a revolution? So that's the thing. If you have this scientific, this ethical attitude, you don't want to make a revolution and change the life condition for this minority or that or that or that. No, there is something autonomous about these quests. You just want to know, because it looks like we don't know all about it. No? So there's a kind of a disinterestedness that is necessary. So parables for the virtual, and just because this is also from a study, a student, I'm trying to explore a little bit how people study today, and then it's beautiful, the resources that people put available. This here is für Deutschunterricht, ich glaube an der Mittelschule oder so, about a description what a parable is. So a parable is ein Nebeneinanderwerfen, ein Gleichnis, ein Vergleich. So that's also characteristic. The place where literature knows most parables is the scriptures. It's the sacred texts. So there's never a dialogical relation between what the text says and how the text addresses you. There's always this kind of structure of Gleichnisse. And I think we should take this serious, but also not be too afraid, because all these discourses already are super religious. So to start to think in terms of Gleichnisse actually gives us a kind of a public domain back. So here, this is the graph, which is unfortunately very bad. But here you can see why it's called a parable. No? So it collects things which come like the light in parallel lines. It collects it to a Brennpunkt, and this Brennpunkt becomes the tertium comparationis. And you see, this is what in logics would not be there, no? Tertium non datur. That's what you have in logic. So it's either this or that. Parables or Gleichnisse is what you will say if you don't accept that there is a binary decision, either this or that. If you insist, no, but it matters how we think of it. It matters how we conceive this. The problem is not clear, ever clearly posed. We need to pose it perhaps a little bit different. So then you need the tertium comparationis. So you need to address the tautology into no, if it shouldn't be if the self-reference shouldn't produce a tautology, but actually kind of be a parabolic mirror for a certain transformation. You need to tell parables, no, to let the things that radiate between me and myself, so wherever there is a self-relation, let it radiate, let it morph, let it find a transformation that you study because you make the instruments for it. And then what is at the very base of it, so you have on the one hand, they always distinguish between an image plane, a Bildebene und Sachebene, so a factual plane or a physical plane and a Bildebene, a metaphorical one. And then you have materielle Gestalt und geistiger Gehalt, so you have all these binaries. But the thing is that in the parable, you can't keep them separate, just like the light rays that the parabolic mirror, no? So the thing is that it's being transformed as a whole. But what I find important is that at the beginning you have not just coding, no? Coding always means you apply a certain way of thinking to something else. But we need to open up the coding to a ciphering such that it involves encoding as much as decoding. No? So when we learn when there is a morale or when there is a fable, we need to share quite a lot of a common world in order to even decipher it. No? So we need to encipher something that we say we cannot say it plainly. No? So because we actually do care about it, we need to encrypt it in such a way that the people with whom I assume we share many values will decipher it in the way that I want to convey it. So this is cryptography from the beginning. So there is a very different relation to language and what code and signs do than this pre-obsession with the signifier and the signified and general linguistics, or before that, a kind of a historical philology, where there would be an original language or the master language or whatever. No, this is just different registers starting to get in resonance with one another, and we can study how. We can study how. So the tertium comparationis, and this is beautiful also because when you write, for example, texts, with this you can make an example without having the class that this example, an example always is a case. But a case means something that happens, like Wittgenstein, the world is all that can be the case. So this is a logical statement because a case can never be singular. Nothing that is singular could possibly be considered a case because a case means it is recognizable. So it needs to happen several times. And it needs to happen in a recognizable way several times. So a case cannot do without order, without rationality, without metrics. You will just not have a case. But with the parables, you can say, no, I have something singular, but I need to speak about it in a parabolic way. So I need to pretend it is a case, even though it isn't. No? So the regularity is not yet there. So you dress it up. You tell stories in order to speak the truth. These are all things which we are not taught today much. No? So people say, beware, this is total power to manipulate, and it's not what you're supposed to learn. But I think because our technology now really does, so we need to grow up to that. And it's at the core of rhetoric. So there is a huge instrumentarium from antiquity of instruments, how we can have an ethical relation to this space of the intellect. So telling parables. I would have 10 more minutes. Should I or should we stop? Yeah. Okay, because I promised the geography in the beginning. No? So this outer space, or the outwith, we can relate to it through geography, through mappings. And what we map is the world, but the world is not the Earth. No? So there is an... yeah, but I will close with this. I want to bring the optical, this physics optics a bit closer. It's also because it's really where the term architectonics is coming from. No? So architectonics was always out of optics. It's about the study of light that we speak of, that people used to speak of architectonics. It's the art of building systems, but the systems are systems of light, not systems of insight. This flipped with Immanuel Kant, who said architectonics becomes a part of logics. It becomes the key for logics. So architectonics tells us where to place our knowledge, no? Before that, it was not like that. It was the world. It was Naturphilosophie. So architectonics was about how to think of the nature of the world if we take serious that everything ultimately is light. So if light is energy and radiation and so on. So this book here, it brings this whole thing a bit further because it says, so Leibniz was this Baroque philosopher with the monadology. So he would say, so he had a lot of ideas that resonate. So with this domain of the subsistence, he would speak of decline in le petit perception. So a domain of making perceptions of which we never grow conscious, but they form our receptivity. And basically, multiplicity is everywhere, no? So one monas, das eine, but then multiplicity is everywhere. But they are kind of co-extending. And what Michel Serres develops in this thinking has a lot to do with this tertium comparationis. He says, Leibniz teaches us how we can think architectonically by putting things always in analogy. So we can never, our representations are never subject and object. No, we don't make a representation. We always need to have a proportionate setup of at least 4 terms. And then it's like we say, okay, we make representations, but we don't take our natural capacities for sight as the toolbox, but we always need to create optical apparatuses in terms of which we put something into objective light. And metaphysically, how we thought of this is by having 2 maximized approaches. One is, they're both mythical topics, so I'm not going into technical mathematics. I couldn't, on the one hand, but also I think there is a certain obscenity to the technical details that in the end, I mean, you should look it up, don't just believe, but I'm not here to speak techniques. But these 2 paradigms, they're embodied by the 2 mythical figures of, they're both Cyclops. One is Argus, of course. You know, Argus is this so Cyclops, they have these big eyes in the middle of the head. So 1 eye, not dioptric, not 2. So we don't have the parallel line which needs to be collected into a mirroring, but just 1 eye. So there's an immediacy in sight. And Argus is this being which is covered all over with eyes. So Argus, I think one story at least says, Hera, I think, yeah, Zeus was supposed to have desired Io, this one, or yeah, this one other whatever being, and Hera got jealous, and in order to protect Zeus from never being able to abduct Io, put Argus to protect her. So Argus would never have to sleep because always only 3 eyes can sleep at a time, and the other eyes will be wide awake. He will see everything. And then there are different versions of the myth, of course, but Hermes, I have this here. Hermes was then hired by Zeus in order to kill Argus. And he lulled him to sleep. So he doesn't need to sleep, but he surrendered to the beautiful music of the harfe, I think, I don't remember. And when he was asleep, Hermes, the god of the communication and the listigkeit, was able to kill it, and Zeus was able to mate with the beautiful bull, which is Io. So that's one story. But Argus is this being which never has to sleep. A lot if you look at the weapon of intelligence services worldwide, almost all of them play with Argus. Yeah. So that's the one side, the maximal side. So Argus, he says an Argusian geometry. So where a projectivity would always go for everything, not what it focuses on, but go into all directions. This is Argus. The other one is Polyphemus. Polyphemus, this is now, so Serre has one of, so on the one hand, Argus, so everything, so it translated in Leibniz already into the idea that everything in the world is not only animate, but also sees actively. So this thing looks at me, this thing looks at me. So there is a sense of a consent between everything among everything, which is part of the Leibnizian system. And it works through sight. So things have eyes. And then you get the idea of an Argusian projectivity. And the other the other one is Polyphemus, and this name literally means not, so this is a being which is not covered all over with eyes, it has mainly this one eye, but it's the abundance of legends and stories. So it's the incorporation of an abundance of legends and stories. And this abundance of legends and stories very literally consumes human life, no? So he is a being which, so in Homer's Ulysses, there is the most famous story where Homer and his companions, they strand in the island of the Cyclops, and they have an encounter with Polyphemus, and Polyphemus eats 2 or 3 of them and then puts them to a cave until the next day. And the story goes that they were able to escape because they attached themselves below the belly of the deer that would in the morning be let to go grazing. So then they escaped, and then from out there, I don't remember how, but there's a story how Ulysses, you can see how they would build a big weapon with which they could go blind Polyphemus. And blind Polyphemus, of course, is read as a metaphor. This is this book here on geography. It's the beginning of geography, no? So as a mapping, as a practice of a mapping, which casts off from this absorptive abundance of stories and legends that will always absorb all clarity. And the beginning, so that's why he says. That's why he says in the beginning. Yeah, it's not here. He says, today we are not taught anything. When we learn geography, we learn that we make maps of the world and so on, but we don't remember that the very condition of making such maps has been to blind Polyphemus. No? So to establish a thinking that concerns with space and not with legends and so on. And this concerning with space comes with writing, so it's the stylus as well where you write, and there is a sacrifice, no? And there is a war act in the beginning. So these cultural techniques, they're not innocent, they're fighting for culture. And we forget about this. It's beautiful how he develops it. And he says, then how can, so then all that there could possibly be about geography is not a theory of geography or not the truth as a positive science. The best that there can be is a manual of how to do geography, which is responsible in the sense it remembers that geography is not innocent. No? So then you ask the question of the logical space, and he will maintain that, and it's for me, it was very surprising. He says the only manual that already exists for geography is Wittgenstein's Tractatus, precisely because the way how it builds up on the totality and the limitedness of logical rigor. That term self-referential. So we need to make a kind of a map, but these maps, they don't cartograph territories. These maps, they make the world, and they make the world in a way that involves the mirroring, because now I don't have this passage. He begins to say the world. So we are also taught wrong because the world, is usually reduced by what we speak of as geography. It means that the world is reduced to the earth. But the world is the domain that opens once we blind Polyphemos. No? So when we go to an abstract space. So this is the not innocence of it. So we need to relate to the world. And that's what the parabolic narrations try to do. No? So the world is established. Almost we could say, yeah, I think that's in the line that I was suggestively trying to propose to you today. Actually, we could say the world is like such a space capsule. And then it's also easy to say, of course, there is not one model for it. Of course, there is not one image for it. But if on the brink, no? Also, so if we have this kind, so the place, der Ort im Weltraum, is this kind of a place that is able to contain in a swelling that is larger than it, then all the world images, the world models, are very much space design. Yeah, so creating an artificial environment with an intellect that may well be artificial, but it's also human because it's humanly proportional, no? In the way that we trust. That's why it's important to not always just go for a revolution, but learn how to be tactful, how to be ethical, how to give things time when they need to change. And they need to change because new abstractions come all the time. So there has never, almost every 100 years, the whole world picture gets thrown off board. And then again, people believe it's not going to happen for us. No, it's a bit astonishing, but it's a bit like that. And it's part of what makes architecture theory so beautiful to study, because it has this long tradition, like philosophy, of a continuous receptivity of the treatises, where these architects always think about everything. So they are space designers, even so when they work for the world. And in the same way now that I learned from you, no, the interest in doing space design is also to learn for the world. Of course, out of a different kind of projection. And what's there? So what do you do if you have on the one hand this act of killing, of blinding Polyphemos, and on the other hand you have the liberated Argusian, no? So because of course Hermes takes over from Argus, no? So Hermes then is the god. That's the beauty in the myth. They always, this is like parabolic mirroring all over, no? So it's really geography. If geography is graphically writing the world into being through processes of mirroring, and these mirrorings, they are they go to an outer space. They reflect from an out with to what we know. Yes. And maybe as a second last to display Amphora, how it sounds. I showed you this book in the beginning, On the Brink by Werner Hamacher. This is from the book, the last part, which he entitles Amphora. And here you can see a bit how this Aristotelian ductus of metaphysical language, how it sounds today. So he will write, for example, the two canonical determinations of space, that it is extended and that it is divisible, are erroneous. Space is extending and dividing. Now see how he works with language, but it's not sophistry. No? So they're not properties, they're activities. Everything that we claim, so in the space of an intellect where things are impersonal, there are no properties, there are activities. But these activities, they don't go linearly. They are like a climate. No, they percolate through one another. You have different scales of atmospheres that literally percolate or filter or crystallize the world into being through this kind of Stimmung, of atmospheric Stimmung. So that's all we need to do is change properties to activities and not make them continuous. No, treat them with Leibniz, both discrete and continuous. Or then, propositions about space give off the appearance of being independent of it, as of something foreign which can be said to have or lack properties without itself being involved, as if its play were not thereby affected. But every proposition is a proposition in or at a space, and every proposition opens a space or closes it. So this is more going to the logical side. We can flip a little bit for perhaps here. The treatise on place, topos, yeah, that's another thing which comes in. No? So it's place, ort is topos and phora. So that, and how these two can be thought together, that would be another lecture. In Aristotle's physics, rejects three assumptions about the essence of place. It is neither the form nor the matter of a thing, nor is it the space between two things. In the first case, it would be in the same place as the thing, and thus two places would be in one and the same place, and there would have to be a place of place. In the first and second cases, it would be affixed to the thing, but while each thing is capable of motion, place, as long as it is the place of the thing, must remain constant. The third case confuses the spatial interval between two boundaries with air. Air is a body like any other, and thus defined by form and matter, cannot be the place of a thing. No, you see how it's the same kind of questions, and that's not because we haven't developed. No, it's not that because we are still thinking the same. No, this is what the term invariance is about. And invariance is never exhausted, but it also never really changes. And invariance is that which allows us to think varieties and variations of always the same. And that doesn't mean we can't be innovative. We can't be creative. Things cannot change. No, it's a bit like the literary scholars are not happy to say it like that, but there are a few and a very few kind of motifs that almost all literature is articulating. There's always jealousy stories, there's always love affairs, there's always competitions between brothers, there's always, so you can name, I don't know, some structuralists, Russian structuralists have tried to actually count it, and they came up with something like 24, 25, really scanning the entire canons in the plural that are available today. Very few motifs, but that doesn't mean, no, these motifs, I mean, wouldn't it be extremely sad if things like sadness or love would ever be put to the point? No, so that's it. No, life would be very unlivable if it were like that. So invariance doesn't mean we don't need to feel humiliated by saying, yes, we try to think exactly the same things like people were trying to think 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, much more. It is very narcissistic in a bad sense. There is also good senses of narcissism because we need to affirm self-reference, no? But this is in a very bad sense narcissistic if we feel humiliated by that. Rather, we can learn from the other articulations. It doesn't mean we cannot be inventive and realize new things. Yeah, so this is a beautiful book, On the Brink. Yeah, okay, it doesn't matter. You know it. That I can suggest to you, no, to go look in these things and what. So not to really understand now Hamacher or Aristotle. These are like one needs to get a familiarity with that, and you can get it if you start to make use of it. So try to do experiments with the ChatGPT when you ask your prompt, not in the straightforward way that we are always taught today. No, say clearly what your interest is, clearly how you will go about it. No, don't be clearly. Be parabolic about it and give it tempers. And you can take in, just like the ChatGPT takes in everything, you can take in everything as well. Why not put your Stimmung for your parable by saying, well, there was this one movie and I don't remember the plot. It did not interest me much, but there was a Stimmung in this movie. And this Stimmung, I want to get it for my parable. And then try to see how you can get out an operationalization that gives you a model of that Stimmung with which you can live, because there is something interesting captured about it. And then this model does not represent the truth of that Stimmung in that film, but that's not what it's about. You see, you make it your instrument and you learn to think with it. So in the out with, it means you can learn to think with everything and try to learn to think with the things that are hostile to you, so that you feel they're not mine. I'm afraid. I don't know this. They put myself into question. Okay, let's make friends with that. No, in the domains which are offered by this artificial intelligence, because it's almost, I don't mean it's cynical, but it's almost like a safe space to do social experiments now. But we need to do it in an ethical way. All right, and some advertisement in the end, because a lot of these things, not directly in this rendering, but this is my new book. It's coming out on December 18, The Digital Continent. No? So what I'm trying to think about here is this continent. So if the digital, now we say everything needs to be digitized. But what if we think of it actually as a kind of a space capsule? So it's a domain which is entirely common because there's no property in the digital, but nobody is native there. It's not like a mother tongue. Everybody needs to learn to speak mathematically if one wants to actually kind of make a residency there, no? So what if we were to think about it like that? Then it would involve nature and poetics. And it will be open access. And this notion of the out with I like a lot. This was a little bit what I was trying to frame. So the space colony, then intellect as life outside of itself, as a kind of a domain, the out with. Then the relation between mirrors in a physical sense, and then parables, so a kind of a fiction telling that encrypts in order to speak the truth, and the relation of architectonics to this. And then these two iconic things, no, Polyphemos, this abundance of legends, which will not let anything grow. No? So that's the point. So Polyphemos swallows up everything because everything has already been there. There's no indigeneity that would kind of surface here. This is a story that, so one can never get rid of it. And then Argus, on the other hand, and this relation between amphora is, of course, also a kind of metaphor. And I'm not yet quite sure why it's an amphora in Aristotle. Because metaphor literally means a vessel to transport things as well. No? So in a way, a metaphor is like on a micro scale, but a parable is on a macro scale of a story. So these are a bit like, I don't know what exactly you can do with all these things, but learn to write prompts, do interesting projects, and be brave. Here are some instruments. Thank you.